Break this down for us. Was this over the past decade that rural communities have been losing their population?
Exactly. There's kind of like three kinds of rural. There's ski resort rural, farm rural, and then kind of like factory rural.
Right.
And farm rural has been, declining since the dawn, and that showed again. And then the others two slowed. And the real sort of difference, I think, over the decade, if we could characterize rural America in this decade, it was that sort of factory rural really got slammed pretty hard with the loss of manufacturing jobs, the recession, and then just sort of that kind of continued decline of factory work in America. It's been doing good lately, actually, but that does not counteract what's happened over that decade.
It's a jobs issue then?
Yeah, for the most part. And another thing you're seeing, exactly, and what you don't see is people weren't moving there.
Right.
So
because
more
probably
people,
there wasn't work.
Exactly, but so the demographers get into all this stuff about like, are people being born versus are people moving there? One thing is something like, I think 36% of rural counties are in what they call natural decrease, which means more people are dying than being born there.
Right.
So
is that natural decrease? Is that this term?
Yes,
natural
I know.
Right.
It's like but in any case. But it's interesting because, they're ski resort rural, as I call it, sort of amenity, lakes, ski resorts. That part, it didn't do as good as the decade before, but it still grew like on par with cities, like 10%, give or take.
And what about rural areas that are sort of near suburban or metropolitan areas?
So that's the other, exactly. So the theme you take out of this is that the rural areas that have like pretty strong connections to urban America, either through just essentially
proximity.
Vacations or retirement or proximity, those are the only parts that seem to be growing at a decent pace. And so I think what you're seeing on the edge, those edge rural counties, right on the edge of a city is, they built lots of houses out, sort of would kind of kiss those counties on the very edge. And actually there's a lot of pain in those areas right now because those are some of the worst housing developments, but they started to increase their population over the decade.
So paint us a picture over why this matters so much. I mean, how much, when we say rural America, Conor, how much of the United States does that occupy?
So it's like 3/4 of the U.S.
3/4.
Yeah, and I mean, you look out a plane window and that doesn't sound all that surprising to you, but.
But it does mean we're having to live somewhere, so are we all packing into the suburbs and the urban areas now?
Exactly. I mean, most of America lives and works in the suburbs. The rest sort of live in, cities in rural America.
Yeah.
And I think, obviously rural America is still really important. It's, huge farming, they still produce lots of food. It's just that those farms are so efficient now, there's not really much work for anybody.
Right.
But, it's still 51 million people. It's, what is that? A little less than 1 in 5 or something like that. And, it's an important part of the country, but it's not really that important part of our economic future anymore. I mean, the service sector is very concentrated.
Right.
It's people work next to each other. It's people like me and you, and that just has gravitated towards cities and suburbs. And so as our kind of job mix moves away from mines and factories and farms, we just kind of naturally congregate in cities, and it's hard to counteract that when so much of the economy is pushing people that way.
It is interesting because certainly the way we live is going to dramatically change based on just more people being concentrated into smaller amounts of land. I mean, we have 3/4 of our country really isn't being utilized to house people. Just the sheer way we sort of exist on top of each other is going to change.
And one thing you see is, I think, a lot of these former kind of factory areas kind of like start tilting towards tourism.
Right.
I mean, I know in Maine they've made a lot of that. All those kind of paper mill areas where, there's nowhere near the employment there once was. They, kind of shift back to, selling trees instead of cutting trees. So, I mean, more and more, the sort of city is just the dominant sort of social force, and that's becoming true internationally as well. It'll
be interesting to see once the economy does turn for good into positive territory. We may see some of that shift again, go back into some of the rural areas.
Exactly. I mean, well, everywhere in the country, when times are bad, people move less.
Right.
So, there's this, although one sort of perverse thing here is that in some of these really like kind of difficult farm counties, they actually hold on to slightly more people in bad times because there's nowhere to go.
There's nowhere else to go. All right, Conor Dougherty, great report by you. More
Thanks.
on WSJ.com.